incredible honor and blessing it is for us to be able to gather today and to proclaim to God that our desire is that he would be glorified in our lives. I love it, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. Open, if you would, please, to Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews 7. And we're going to talk a little bit more about when I was a kid, so kind of covering some things that I was taught wrong, that I taught wrong later, and have been working to correct in my teaching and preaching. Here's what we have on tap today. Our theology is this: the death of Jesus inaugurated the new covenant and freed people of faith from sin's power and penalty. Our application today is this: we look to the death of Jesus and his resurrection as the finished work of God, and our prayer today is, God, give us a deeper understanding of your grace. Family focus is simple. It's that Jesus died and rose for us. Jesus died and rose for us. This idea that the death of Jesus inaugurated the new covenant and freed people of faith from sin's power and penalty, this is, I'll tell you that for me growing up, I was not taught, at least not sufficiently so that I remembered it, taking it into my college years and then adult years. I was not taught that there were two covenants in the Bible. I was taught that it's just kind of one thing. And look, I'll be the first to tell you, I believe that the Bible as a whole is one story of God's redemptive work through Jesus. I really do believe that. And we can have that conversation. We can talk about it later. I hope that if today produces questions for you, that you'll reach out to me. I don't ever shy away from text or phone calls on these kinds of things. And so what we want to look at today is that there was an old covenant and there's a new covenant, and that these two things are not the same thing, that they're different. The old covenant being primarily the old covenant of the law. It was the Aaronic, Aaron's priesthood of the tribe of Levi. It was the tent of meeting that Moses built, later the temple that Solomon built. It was Mount Sinai and the giving of the laws. And then there is the new covenant that is formed by Christ in his blood and focuses on his death and his resurrection. So pick up with me today in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11. And what I would recommend for you to do is at some point this week, read Hebrews 7 through 10 in one sitting. Read those 4 chapters in one sitting. I think that would be very beneficial for you. Hebrews 7:11 says this: Now if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one named from the order of Aaron? So really quickly, Melchizedek, super cool dude to talk about. He's only mentioned in 5 chapters of the Bible. He's mentioned in Genesis 14, Psalm 110, and then Hebrews 5, 6, and 7. And Melchizedek was the first mentioned priest of God in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 14, it is about 700 years, 640-ish years before the Levitical priesthood is put into place. And so there was the priesthood of Aaron, which served in the tent of meeting, served in the tabernacle, served later in the temple, the priesthood of Aaron. And then there is the priesthood of Melchizedek, of which Christ is compared to, a different type of priest. Now notice how this verse 11 starts off. If perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, why would there be a need for another priest to arise? In other words, if the first covenant, if the old covenant could have made people perfect, there isn't the necessity for a second covenant. That's simple, okay? If the first thing could have done the job, you don't need a second thing, okay? And then look at verse 12. For when there is a change in priesthood, there is also necessarily a change in the law as well. For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is a change in the law as well. Meaning, the priest of Aaron, of his line, handed down the 10 Commandments and the law of Moses that were given on Mount Sinai. And those people said, here's how we worship, and here's what the sacrifices should be like, and here's the tent of meeting, and here's all the ways that you can give sacrifices, and here's what makes the sacrifice acceptable. Here's what makes a person clean or unclean. And then the new priest, Jesus, comes in, and he starts a new law, a new instruction. So if there's a new priesthood, those used to be of Levi, and now Jesus, he's of the tribe of Judah. He's a priest like Melchizedek. He's a new priest, and therefore there is a new priesthood, and there is a new law. Drop down, if you would, to verse 18. We don't have time to go through all 4 of these chapters today. I really wish that we did. It says this: For on the one hand, the former commandment, the old covenant, is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. Now, he's already said in verse 11 that perfection wasn't attainable through the law. But then look here again at verse 18. He's going to say three things. It was set aside because it was weak, and it was what? Useless, and the law made nothing perfect. What did the law make perfect? Nothing. The law can't make anything perfect. On the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God, the new covenant by which people draw near to God. And it was not, continue reading with me in verse 20, and it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests of the line of Aaron were made without an oath, but this one, Christ, was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. So Christ is a priest for how long? Forever. And that's a quote from Psalm 110. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Is the covenant of Jesus, the new covenant, better than the old? Yes, okay? The former priests, those who were of the line of Aaron, were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, which is still one of the funniest verses in the whole Bible to me because I have a dark, twisted sense of humor. But it says that the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So you go, man, the old covenant sure had a whole bunch of priests. Why did it have so many priests? Well, because the priests kept dying. That's what happened. They kept dying. Over hundreds and hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, the priests kept dying, so they needed replacement priests, right? But it says he, verse 24, speaking of Jesus, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost completely those who draw near to God through him because he always lives to make intercession for them. So already Jesus is a better priest because the Old Testament priest couldn't continue to make intercession for the people because they kept dying and he needed a new priest. But Jesus remains priest for how long? Forever, and is able to make intercession forever. Drop down to chapter 8. I'm going to pick up in verse 6. Again, we don't have time to go through all 4 of these chapters in great detail, not in 30 minutes. But look at verse 6. Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old. Speaking of the priesthood, Christ's ministry as a priest is better than the old, as much as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So catch this from verse 6. The ministry of Christ is better, the covenant is better, and the promises are better. You catch that from that there in verse 6? So the old covenant had a ministry, had a covenant, had promises, and the ministry and the covenant and the promises of Christ are what? Better, okay? No debate there. We don't disagree with that. Verse 7, for if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for the second. Now that should make you think of chapter 7, verse 11. If perfection had been attainable through the first, you don't need a second. Chapter 8, verse 7, if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for the second. So what we've seen so far is that the old covenant could not make anyone perfect. The old covenant was weak and useless. That the old covenant could not make anyone perfect. Again, that's there. That the old covenant it was faulty, because if it had been faultless, there's no need for a second. Everybody got it? So you have an old covenant that is weak and powerless and faulty and cannot make anyone perfect, and you have a new covenant that is not weak, not powerless, and makes people perfect. Verse 8. For God finds fault with them when he says, and this is a quote from Jeremiah 31, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, that I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made their fathers on the day that I took them to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. So God, the author of Hebrews here, referencing Jeremiah 31, says, God said, I'm going to make a new covenant with these people. Because the covenant I've given them, they're not following, they're not obeying, they're not submitting to, so I'm going to make a new covenant with these people. Drop down to 8:13. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So in speaking of the new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. What is becoming obsolete grows old and is ready to vanish away. All right. So a couple of things. One, Jeremiah 31 is approximately 600 years before Jesus walked on the earth, right? It's about that, okay? And so God, through the prophet Jeremiah, tells the people, look, this covenant's not working. I'm going to give you a new covenant. He tells them that about 600 years before the new covenant comes, right? Before Jesus comes to inaugurate the new covenant. Everybody good? All right, so he says it's growing obsolete. So when the author here says, he goes, when he speaks of the new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. What's becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The mistake that some people make is they say, see, it's not obsolete yet. The law's not obsolete yet. The old covenant's not obsolete yet. But it is because it was made obsolete by the death of Jesus. In Luke 22, Jesus, when he's on the last night of the life of Christ, he's there with the disciples, and he holds up the cup of the Lord's Supper, or the Passover supper for them, but he's inaugurating the Lord's Supper, and he holds up the cup, and he says, this is the blood of the new covenant poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. The blood of Jesus, his shed blood on the cross, starts the new covenant. And the old covenant becomes obsolete with the inauguration, with the beginning of the new. Everybody good still? Okay, the old covenant's gone. I was not taught old new covenant growing up. I just wasn't, okay? I was taught you're a sinner. That's true enough. I was taught all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. True enough. I was taught that the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life, Romans 6:23. Of course, I was taught Ephesians 2, that we are all by nature objects of God's wrath. Got it. But I was not taught two covenants, okay? And it's important for us, if we're going to understand the Bible correctly, to understand, like when you're reading the prophets of the Old Testament, that they are under an old covenant, and that there is a promise of righteousness and faith. There's a promise of a new covenant, even as far back as Genesis chapter 12, really, there's this beautiful promise of this new covenant. So, here's our application today. We look to the death of Jesus and his resurrection as the finished work of God. But pick up with me in chapter 9, verse 1. So the old covenant is obsolete. The old covenant is powerless. The old covenant has fault. The old covenant is weak. The old covenant can't make anything perfect. Chapter 9, in the beginning, I'll tell it to you instead of reading it, because the reading is kind of clunky, I think. The old covenant had priests. And the old covenant had sacrifices. And the old covenant had a tent of meeting, of which there was an outer court that was 60 feet long by 30 feet wide. And the old tent of meeting had an inner court that was 30 feet by 30 feet called the Holy of Holies. And that's where the Ark of the Covenant was. That's where the altar of incense was. And the high priest, once a year, only the high priest once a year could go into the Holy of Holies and make sacrifices for the people. So there's not a test afterwards, but who gets to go in? High priest. One guy. How many times? Once a year. Gets to go in for sins of himself and for the people. And he offers his own blood, not his own blood, he offers blood for his own sins and then sins for the people. All right, that's it. And so the high priest gets to go in once a year. Look at verse 6. These preparations having thus been made, the temple, the Old Testament altar, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies, these preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section performing their ritual duties, but into the second section only the high priest goes, and only once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers first for himself and then for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy place is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age, meaning the present age of the Jews, the present age of Israel. Now, the Holy of Holies was partitioned off with a veil, with a curtain, and only the high priest could go in once a year. But when Christ died, we see in Matthew 26 that when Christ died, the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom, opening the way effectively for people to come into the presence of God, right? Because through Christ's death, the new covenant is started. Right? Through Christ's death, the new covenant begins. So under the old covenant, one person once a year gets to go into the Holy of Holies. With Christ's shed blood, the veil of the Holy of Holies is ripped, showing now that everybody by faith in Jesus can come into the Holy of Holies. In fact, if you read on in chapter 10, it will say that the way into the presence of God was opened through the flesh, through the body of Jesus Christ. And so Christ has made open the way for people to come into the presence of God. Old covenant, no one could come into the presence of God, only the high priest, only him once a year, and then he was going to die and we needed a new high priest. New covenant, because of the death of Jesus, all people by faith can come into the presence of God, and there is no hindrance now to people coming into the presence of God. Got it? Okay, so look at this in verse 9. So he's saying that this is symbolic of the present age, and this is so important. Listen, according to this arrangement, so the Old Testament sacrifices, the Old Testament gifts, according to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. This is the third way that he said it can't make anyone perfect. But they deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations of the body imposed until the time of Reformation. So these sacrifices of the Old Testament could not make anyone clean, and they couldn't even cleanse your conscience, right? So my buddy Kevin back here, I've known Kevin since January-ish of 2003. And so Kevin and I are friends, and I do something wrong to Kevin, and I owe him an apology, right? And if we're friends and I apologize, he's like, okay, we're good. If the next day I do something wrong again, what do? I go and apologize to him again. Every time I apologize, it's an indication that I have done something wrong, right? And I'm coming before him, I'm like, dude, look, man, so I screwed up again, and I was rude to you, or I said this about you, or whatever, right? And I'm fixing it. And so the Old Testament sacrifices jump really quickly over to 10:2. So he says that there isn't a sacrifice that could make perfect those who draw near. 10:2. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to have been offered, since the worshiper, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin. But in these sacrifices year after year, there is a reminder of sin. In other words, if you're in the Old Testament, every time you bring an offering, you're declaring what? I'm guilty. I'm a sinner. And the next day, what do you have to do? You got to bring another offering, saying effectively what? I'm guilty. Every time I go apologize to Kevin, what am I effectively doing? I'm guilty, and I'm having to apologize. And so the Old Testament sacrifices couldn't ever cleanse the conscience, because what are you going to be tomorrow? Guilty. So you're going to have to bring another sacrifice, right? That's the Old Covenant. So notice 9:9, that the Old Testament sacrifices could not cleanse the conscience of the worshiper. Bear with me here. Chapter 9, verse 11. But when Christ appeared as the high priest of the good things that have to come, and then through the greater and more perfect tent, not the one made with hands, not of this creation, he, Christ, entered once for all. Start listening for once for all. Entered once for all into the holy places, not by the means of blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, securing eternal redemption. What kind of redemption? Eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of the defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Purify our what? Conscience from dead works to serve the living God. The Old Testament sacrifices, can they purify your conscience? No. Can Christ? Yes, because we don't need another sacrifice. We've been made righteous forever. We've been declared redeemed by God forever. It's eternal redemption. We have been declared holy by God through the work of Jesus. We don't need another sacrifice once a year going into. He's made open the way now. Now we've been brought into the presence of God. That's new covenant. Is that different than the old covenant? Yes, very, very different than the old covenant. Okay? And so if you keep reading with me here, look at verse 15. Therefore, he is the mediator, Jesus is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, a will like when you die, for where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, listen carefully to verse 18 here. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. So, I'll just read it to you. Verse 19, for when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and a hyssop stick and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God has commanded you. Moses in Exodus, I think 24, comes down from the mountain. He reads to the people the book of the law to all the people. He makes a sacrifice. He takes the blood of that sacrifice, sprinkles the book of the covenant, and then sprinkles the people that are in attendance there. It's 1.5 million people, so not everybody's getting sprinkled actually with the blood. But he's sprinkling the people, and he's saying, this is the covenant that God has made with you. The first covenant, the old covenant, the covenant of law. And notice what he says here. Verse 18, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. Implying what? That the second covenant was what? Inaugurated with blood. So, this is so important. I really hope that this will make sense to you. So the old covenant was started with blood, and the new covenant was started with blood. The old covenant with the blood that was shed after Moses came down from the mountain. The new covenant with the shed blood of Christ at the cross, right? Does that make sense? That's the beginning of the new covenant. And so, verse 21, in the same way he sprinkled with blood both the tent and all the vessels Moses used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things, i.e., the altar and the tent of meeting and the priesthood. Thus, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are mere copies of the true things, but Christ has gone into heaven itself to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places year after year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. So does Jesus have to be offered repeatedly for the new covenant? No. As it is, he appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes the judgment, so Christ, having also been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Keep rolling. Chapter 10. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the very form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices continually offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. Fourth time now we've been told that the law can't make anything perfect. Otherwise, they would have ceased to have been offered, since the worshipers, having been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin, which we saw in chapter 9. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. It's impossible. And then he's going to quote Psalm 40 here, and then he's going to say this about Jesus. Jesus adds, verse 9, then he adds, behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. Christ does away with the first what? Covenant, to establish what? The second covenant. He does away with the first to establish the second. And then he says this in verse 10, thank you. And by that will we have been sanctified, that is, set apart as holy, through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. You've been sanctified, you've been set apart for holy, as holy, once for all time. That's the work of Jesus. Could the old covenant do that? No. Verse 11, and every priest stands daily at his service under the old covenant, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sin. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies would be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being made holy. He has done what? Perfected. 4 times we've been told that the old covenant could not make anyone perfect, and now we're told that the new covenant through Christ does what? Makes perfect. For how long? Eternally, for all time. Okay? Now here's where it matters. Because here's the way that I was taught this. I was taught, in my head, I have pictures in my head. In my head, I have these 2 boxes or bricks, and one's the old covenant and one's the new covenant. And I like to write stories. I like to tell stories. I would like to be a real writer one day, and fingers crossed. But anyway, so here's the way that the story has been told me, and here's how I told it for 20 plus years. You're a sinner. Look at Adam and Eve. They sinned. Sin entered the world. You're a sinner. You're a sinner. You're a sinner. Aaron came. He made some sacrifices. Those didn't work. Moses built a tent of meeting. That didn't work. Solomon built a temple. That didn't work. And then the end of the story, what we do is we say at the end of the story is the cross. And now finally the cross worked. That's how we typically tell the story. We get up in front of people, and for 30 or 40 minutes, we'll tell them, look at what bad sinners we are, look, we are enemies of God without Christ, okay? That is who we are without Christ. For the wages of sin is death without Jesus, all right? And so we tell this story of look at what wicked sinners we are, and then we put the cross at the end of the telling of that story. And part of the reason I think we do that is because we don't understand the two covenants. Part of the reason I think we do that is because it's kind of how we in the West tell stories. So think of any romantic comedy you've ever seen, and you know from the first 45 seconds the couple that they're going to have together at the end of the movie. You already know, right? Like, you just do. You get introduced to this main character, and you're like, they're going to end up together. And then at some point, they start dating. And then at some point, inevitably, there's a misunderstanding, right? Which could have been solved by a single text every single time. And the girl's like, I'm so mad I saw him with another woman. And they're like, well, who was it? I don't know. And then later you find out it's his sister who was in town visiting for a day. And you're like, if she had just said, who is that woman I saw you at the store with? Oh, that's my sister. Oh, I would love to meet your sister. And then it's done. But they need to create the 45 minutes of drama so that at the very end, one of them can be running in the rain or driving hurriedly down the street to get to the airport, but there's a traffic jam, and then they get out, and then they have to run, and then they get there, and they see the plane taking off, and they turn around, and then they're there because they didn't get on the plane, and you're like, oh, that's so good, right? The other version of that is a Rocky movie or an action movie where the good guy has just defeated 45 guys. And he comes in to save the day, and then there's the boss who somehow is just superior in every way to them, just a little bit faster, just a little bit stronger. And the good guy has to go into the flashback of his training when he was just a youth from the sensei and just remember all that stuff and then get victory. And you're like, yes, and they get victory. That's how we like to tell the story. Look at the underdog, look at the downcast. Here's the victory, and that's how we tell the story. It doesn't work with the story of the gospel. It doesn't. Here's why. The old covenant is obsolete, powerless, and weak, and can't make anyone perfect. Now, let me just bear these questions out. Is the cross weak? No. Is it powerless? Is it obsolete? Is it incapable of making people perfect? No. Then it can't be part of the old covenant. We can't put it at the end, the last page of the old covenant, and say this is the solution to the old covenant. We have to make it the first page of the new covenant. The cross isn't the solution to the faulty old covenant. It is, sort of, but it's not the end of that story. The cross is the first page of the new covenant. It's the wellspring of life. If you're reading a book, and I love to write, this is the way the book would read. Instead of, you're pathetic, but don't worry, here's the cross. Here's the way the book would read. Page 1 would be like, let me tell you about the cross that is powerful for righteousness. Let me tell you about the cross that is powerful for perfection and life and holiness. Let me tell you about the cross that brings about change. Let me tell you about the cross that makes you a new creature. Let me tell you about the cross that imparts to you everything you've ever needed for life and godliness, 2 Peter chapter 1. Let me tell you about the cross that imparts to you the Holy Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead, who's now at work in you. And then every subsequent page is, look at who you are because of the cross. The cross belongs at the beginning of the new covenant. I was never taught that. I wasn't even taught new and old. I was taught, we're really pathetic. Aren't you glad for the cross? But you know what that has people doing? It has people walking out the doors of the church going, man, I'm really pathetic. I'm sure thankful for the cross. And they're walking out going, I'm pathetic. Rather than walking out going, man, we have started by the cross. And we walk out in power. We walk out in victory. We walk out with sin having been dealt with and our consciences cleansed. Like, if I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but just think about it. How many of you grew up in church and your feeling before God was almost always one of guilt? Don't raise your hand, but you're just like, man, God's probably mad at me today, or I didn't do this well enough today, or God's unhappy with me today. That's old covenant. The old covenant couldn't cleanse the conscience. The blood of Christ does. And so now I'm able to say I am righteous and loved and holy and forgiven. And so old covenant, the cross isn't at the end of it because that's obsolete. The new covenant, inaugurated, started by the blood of Christ, promises life and redemption and holiness and power. And if we put it at the wrong part of the story, see, the mistake that we make is that's a different sermon, different time. January, we're starting Matthew, so I'll tell you in January. Sure, there's more I'm supposed to say, but look, here's what I want you to know. There are two covenants. one which could not make anyone perfect, can't cleanse the conscience of the sinner, can't deal with sin, is powerless, is weak, is faulty, is obsolete and fading away, and one that is the exact opposite of all of that, full of power, can create and make the conscience clean, can make us stand perfect before God, not on our own merit, but on the merit of Jesus Christ. And so now here we are these people who our story begins with the cross. It doesn't end with the cross. And I don't know if that little subtlety clicks in your brain, but I promise you it makes a huge difference for how you think about yourself as a follower of Jesus. Because if the story you're reading to yourself over and over and reciting to yourself over and over is the old covenant, man, I'm a pathetic person, thank God for the cross. That will change how you view the cross and how you view yourself in light of the cross. But if you put the cross at the beginning of the story and say, thank God for the cross, which is life and godliness and forgiveness and holiness and redemption, eternally secured by God, my conscience cleansed, I have been welcomed into his presence, that will change how you view yourself in light of the cross. We are people of the new covenant, not of the old. And it matters that we think rightly about the death of Jesus, and it grieves me that I spent 25 years putting the cross at the end of the old covenant rather than rightly making it the beginning of the new. I can't go back and undo that. I can try to be faithful from this point forward. When you have questions, inevitably you will, please don't let them rot in your brain. Come and talk to me about them. Here's our prayer today. God, give us a deeper understanding of your grace. Would you take a moment to pray that where you're seated? Lord God, we thank you for your grace that you've extended to us through Jesus Christ. We thank you for the new covenant by which, through faith, righteousness has been imparted to us. God, that we can have a clean conscience before you, that we can stand before you blameless, without guilt, not on any merit of our own, but on the precious and wonderful work of Jesus Christ through his death and his resurrection. I thank you, God, that the cross is powerful to save, that in it is redemption, in it is forgiveness, in it is life. And I thank you, God, that that's where our story begins, at the cross of Christ. I pray, Lord, that you would help us to live like people who have been changed, who have been made new, who have been forgiven, who have been sanctified, who have been made holy, who have been called saints and your children, and Lord, that we belong to you. Help us to live that way. Lord, no longer to live in the shadow of our shame, but to live in the light of your glory, as long as we draw breath or until Christ returns.